Studies at Austin Community College, and welcome to Civil Society, where we explore issues affecting communal well-being through a nonprofit lens. We're a proud partner of ACCTV, but during COVID, we're going virtual for our 4th season. Our center is fully committed to being an anti-racist organization, to accelerating our personal learning journeys, confronting our biases and blind spots, and creating opportunities for others to do the same. This episode is a part of our 10-episode series on the Black experience in Austin, which will be followed by series on the Latinx, the Asian Pacific, and the Native American Indigenous experiences in Austin. As we said in our public statement on racial equity back in June, we're moved by a new sense of urgency to heighten our community's consciousness of institutional racism and systemic impediments to racial equity, and to aggressively progress on the continuum to racial equity, to fulfill America's promise to all of its inhabitants. You can access recordings of earlier episodes and register for future programs at nonprofitaustin.org/civil society. My guests today are Sean Thomas Brietfeld, co-director of the Building Movement Project, and Ofronama Bayou, senior research associate at the project, who also was an author of the report on Central Texas. As you'll quickly see, their passion for service and social change are self-evident. Both have decades of experience as professionals and in advocacy. Their bio narratives are on our website. Sean and Ofronama, thank you for joining me today. Sean, this is your 2nd time on the show. Show them your mug, let them see that there's proof. Ofronama's is in the mail. Last time you were here with your director, your co-director, and we discussed the original report, which now is 3 years old, as we'll talk about. So at the outset, I want you both to know that I admire and appreciate the work that each of you and your project has been doing. It's been a significant asset and help to me and my colleagues in better understanding what's going on. And has actually motivated action, not just by us, but by other organizations in our city. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much. That's great to hear.
Yeah, well, good work, very good work. So your most recent report, Race to Lead Revisited, Obstacles and Opportunities in Addressing the Nonprofit Racial Leadership Gap. You need to get them up with shorter titles for your reports. Okay. Focuses on 3 key findings. The findings of the original report to lead of Race to Lead, which is still relevant after 3 years, that there's a white advantage in the nonprofit sector, and that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are widespread, but, and parenthetically, unfortunately, their effectiveness is uncertain. You report that people of color at nonprofits continue to face significant challenges as compared with their white counterparts, including a lack of mentorship and opportunities for promotions. That DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has become a checkbox, and that training on diversity helps people say the right things publicly while providing cover for maintaining the current arrangements of power that often exclude or minimize the leadership of people of color. So most distressing, you report that there's been little change in the 3 years since your first report. So most obvious question is, why do you think that's the case?
Sure. So first, thanks again for reaching out to us at Building Movement Project. Both Ofronama and I are really happy to be able to share with you the results of the national report, Race to Lead Revisited, as well as the report focused on what we heard from respondents in Central Texas in particular. In terms of the question about why more hasn't changed in a 3-year period, I think one explanation is that this kind of change is not often fast unless you're in a movement moment. And we happen to be in a movement moment now, but when the survey was conducted that the report is based on, it was 2019. And so I don't think people were seeing organizational change at that time. We weren't seeing organizations declare their support for Black Lives Matter and the broader movement at that time that the survey was being fielded. And so it's sort of a similar situation to what we had the first time around, where the survey was conducted before Trump's election. And I think what happened for the sector was, the data came out though post-election. And I think that it helped to both the political moment and then the increasing conversations about race equity helped to spur much more consciousness, critical conversations in organizations, all of which is important, necessary. And I think one of the possible explanations is that, as people develop a more critical consciousness, they then have more critical things to say about the organizations that they're a part of. And so if organizations are cultivating the capacity to have those difficult conversations, but not actually changing anything about the organizational structures, I think it's then not surprising that we wouldn't be seeing change. And then in some cases, we saw more negative perceptions of organizations in the sector in the 2019 survey than we saw with the original Race to Lead survey.
Thank you. Ofronama, how does what Sean is saying relate to the report you did on Central Texas, which was released, I believe, a month ago in May, or a month or two ago in May?
The survey we did most recently was, again, after the, in September, it was before the recent movements. We had 5,200 people respond to the survey, and 350 were from the Central Texas area. And I have to give a big thank you to Mission Capital, really helped us push the survey out and also helped us get some of the focus groups done as well. So we don't really have a comparison to the previous survey for the Central Texas area, but I'm happy to share some of the findings from the Central Texas report, a lot of which definitely aligns with what we saw nationally and some of the things that you shared. So some of the negative experiences and perceptions that people of color are having in organizations, some of the diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, but without real change happening. Those are some of the big findings. I could get into more later on.
And we'll come back to specifically the Austin or Central Texas report. The word is bandied about a lot, white advantage. Can you each talk about what is white advantage? How does white advantage look and feel, if you will, to a person of color versus, versus a person who's, quote, white?
Yeah, well, I think that was a part of the report that we as a team really debated back and forth and to some extent agonized over how to frame what we were seeing. What we wanted to do was frame it as not just about the sort of privileges that are conferred on white people given sort of overall the dominance and preferences in society. We also wanted to really focus on the structural benefits that accrue to organizations where the leadership of those organizations is overwhelmingly white. And part of the reason for that analysis, looking at both the board composition and the composition of the organization's leadership team, was that particularly in conversations in the follow-up to the original Race to Lead report, I started hearing from more leaders of color, EDs and CEOs, who had been promoted to the top job in an organization, but they inherited these organizations with overwhelmingly white boards or largely white senior staff teams. And so we're facing a lot of difficulty. And so it challenged us to recognize that, the person at the top of the organizational hierarchy matters, but it's not the whole story. And so this was an attempt to look at the sector with a slightly more structural analysis as opposed to just focusing on the individual person in the ED CEO role. And in terms of what it actually looks like, the data was pretty clear and compelling that organizations that had a majority of the board and people in senior leadership being white had reported larger budgets. And so again, this is all based on what staff of those organizations are reporting about the organizations where they work. But still, larger budgets, some of the other things that we've seen in other parts of the survey related to, less difficulty building relationships with funders, things like that. And Ofronama can also talk a little bit more about some of the experiential differences that we saw when we looked at looked at people's experience in terms of like whether they feel they have voice, things like that, based on which kind of organization they are a part of. Ofronama, do you want to add some more?
Sure, and I would add that the disparity around budgets was also something that we observed in Central Texas, and also having conversations with CEOs during focus groups. So the CEOs of color tended to lead these smaller budget organizations. We're really struggling with getting more funding from foundations and other entities. So to add to what Sean was saying about the white advantage, in the survey, we asked the respondents about some of the experiences they were having in their organization, such as whether they had a voice, whether they saw fair and equitable opportunities for advancement, whether they would want to stay in the organization in 3 years. And we saw that respondents, both people of color and white, who worked in organizations that had more people of color in leadership, both in senior staff roles and in board roles, they had higher ratings on those questions. So we think that speaks to dynamics that happen when there's very few people of color on boards and in senior leadership. We're responding to some of the conditions that are happening, or creating and cultivating some conditions that are pretty negative for all staff and organizations, versus when you have more people of color in leadership. We also saw that for people of color and white respondents who worked in organizations with more diversity in senior leadership and in board, they had higher ratings on whether the organization really had a strong commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So again, that speaks to what's different about people of color in leadership and some of the priorities and efforts that they're making.
So that sort of begs the question that in terms of significant efforts, what, from your studies and from your own experiences, what would constitute a significant effort within an organization to actually address these inequities? Clearly, just placing a person of color at the head of the organization sort of smacks of tokenism and doesn't really achieve the larger goal. It moves towards it, but doesn't achieve it. So what are your suggestions in that regard?
So it's important for organizations to do the culture change work that I think often the trainings get at, and also to pay attention to the organization's structure, right? So, there's a sort of adage around management that culture eats structure for lunch, but I think when it comes to DEI, I don't think that that's actually the case. So like organizations that are sort of overwhelmingly white in the sort of power positions in those organizations, I think our data helps to show that just focusing on cultural change and everyone getting along and having open communication, that's necessary, but it's probably not going to be sufficient. And so I think that's also, though, where part of the question around the time horizon in terms of what kind of organizational change that we're likely to see, because organizations are not, many nonprofit organizations are not in the practice of hiring continually, particularly senior leadership roles. But it becomes really incumbent on organizations, particularly organizations with white leaders who may be thinking about what is next for them, to be ensuring that they are doing cultural change work internally so that their organization, the board, the leadership team can support and embrace the leadership of someone who does not look like the exiting leader. And that really becomes, part of how we have to think about this, but it does then also mean that, those organizations that are sort of in that white run camp are going to have a transition that will happen over time. I think another maybe possibly more immediate challenge to the sector is to just start investing more in the organizations that are already led by people of color, right? They already, are doing the work closest to the ground. They already, according to our data, are providing a better work experience for staff of color and white staff. So I really feel like it is a challenge to the philanthropic world in terms of assessing where are their grant dollars going, and how might they make shifts or increases such that more of their grant dollars would go to organizations that have not received the kind of investment that peer organizations that are white-led have in the past.
Is it your impressions that there is a significant, it appears from reports, but is it your impressions from your contacts that significant new dollars are being directed towards Black organizations, Black leaders, towards this larger agenda of anti-racism, equity, and so forth?
Yes, that is my sense. And I think that, you can see it in terms of the statements and the commitments that some big national funders are making in terms of, directing hundreds of millions of dollars to organizations that had previously not been on their radar or not received that kind of investment and support. And that's really important. That's great. And I think it's useful for more funding organizations to take up that challenge. And, even if it means going beyond the 5% payout, like that should be not a sort of a ceiling for philanthropic organizations. Like this is a moment when we're both in a crisis nationally, but nonprofit organizations are facing a crisis, right? Like there are a lot of organizations who feel like they're on the edge of a cliff because this is the time when organizations may be preparing for a new fiscal year and have a lot of uncertainty about the impact of the COVID, the multiple epidemics that we're dealing with in this country, from structural racism to COVID to the economic crisis, and how that's going to affect the support and funding that's going to be directed to organizations in the coming months. And so for those philanthropic organizations, for people with wealth, this is the time to really increase their investment, not to sort of hold back or wait and see.
Good point. Ofronama, what I'd like to turn to is the report that you helped author about Central Texas. In the beginning of the report, you make reference to the economic and social divisions that I think we in Austin are unfortunately well aware of. Talk a bit about what the report says, its implications, and what you think it can do to help change the existing equations.
Great. So, as I mentioned before, the findings were similar in many ways to the national report. So some of the big findings, one, there's certainly disparate access to networks of professional support for people of color in the nonprofit sectors compared to white respondents. We got that from the survey data, as well as in the focus groups. What people of color were saying was that they had access to wonderful networks, but these weren't the networks that were valued in the city and that are considered helpful for moving ahead or getting funding or getting certain positions. We also observed people of color having discouraging and damaging workplace experiences. So as we've talked about, we saw that people of color felt like they didn't have a voice in nonprofits compared to their white respondents in the survey in Central Texas. They also didn't see fair and equitable opportunities for advancement. And in the focus groups, the people of color said that they didn't want to remain in their organizations in the near future. And the reasons for that had to do with not having a voice and not seeing the ability to advance, and race being a barrier for that. Mm-hmm. We also saw that people of color were less likely to have received performance raises or even cost of living raises in their white counterparts in Central Texas, all while being in lower socioeconomic status and having lower income, which was a bigger difference we saw in Central Texas and nationally, where the difference wasn't as clear. We also saw that people of color were more likely to report being paid less than their colleagues doing the same work. And then there's disparities, of course, in leadership. So too few people of color on boards and leading nonprofit organizations. And for the ones that are in leadership positions, often heading up smaller organizations and struggling to get funding. And then finally, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, we asked, does your organization do something around DEI? Most respondents said yes. In the focus groups, what people said was that there's an overemphasis on training in Central Texas. They thought it's a good start, certainly, but it shouldn't be the idea that if you have a couple trainings, everything's going to be great now. What we saw instead was that people of color didn't see that their leaders were as committed to diversity, equity, inclusion as their white counterparts. So there's no real efforts, for example, to address salary disparities, to look at how people are paid and fix that, to have policies to address discrimination in the workplace, to make sure that people of color have a voice and that when they speak up, they're heard and they're not punished for saying things that are uncomfortable. And that finally, that there's really goals set around diversity, equity, inclusion that are measured, that are revisited, just like you would have goals and strategies for something else related to programs or related to fundraising.
So in the study of Central Texas, what was the perceptions of those individuals who were Black who were leading organizations? Were there many people in your report? Was there enough of a sample of individuals who were leading organizations?
There was not. I believe Black respondents were about 4% of the Central Texas respondents. Certainly have participation in the focus groups. So it's, we can't really disaggregate by race in that way. I could talk about big picture nationally, what we're seeing from Black respondents, if that's helpful, especially Black women. So recently we shared a blog post about the Black women who responded to the Race to Lead survey. And unfortunately, a lot of what we found in the first report, in the first Women of Color, there's a specific Women of Color report, we had a breakout on Black women in the sector. So a lot of the findings are similar, dealing with some of the same stereotypes, some of the same ways in which they're held back and not able to advance, being questioned about their work, salary disparities as well. Many of those things that we found the first time are at the forefront today in this most recent report.
So what would you want to see done in Central Texas? What could you tell a colleague who's not the CE to help a colleague of color? Like, how could a coworker or a mentor maybe help a colleague of color?
Specifically for Central Texas, one of the things we noticed in the focus groups was that, as I said, people of color felt like they didn't have a voice in their organizations. What they leaned on was white colleagues who spoke up, and they were listened to when the white colleagues spoke up about the Black leaders of color or some of the discriminatory, disparaging experiences that they were seeing among people of color. So that is something that white colleagues can do. So it's not right that if a person of color speaks up, they're not listened to, but I do think it's helpful for white colleagues to speak up and help other people of color in the workplace and lend that voice and support.
Great. And then would that be different or the same for a CEO or a top professional? Would you see them sort of serving, what it sounded like you were describing was really being an ally, but would that be different for the CEO or the top professional?
I mean, the top professional has the power, so they can say, stop doing this or start doing that. So they have even more responsibility. And of course, I was going to add for the colleagues as well to not engage in those discriminatory behaviors themselves. I'll add that. And Sean, do you want to add anything to the role of the CEO or top leaders?
I agree with Ofronama's point around whoever is at the top of an organizational hierarchy has even more responsibility. It's more incumbent on them to both be taking seriously the concerns of staff and then also working to address them. And one of the things that I think organizational leaders can do is clearly communicate to their leadership teams what the commitment of the organization is regarding race equity in terms of how that then impacts staff management. I think that some people may need support being better managers, and particularly if they're managing across lines of difference. And so, but that's not to say that like all of the investment for DEI strategy should be focused on people at the top of an organizational hierarchy, but recognizing the sort of potential for people in positions of power to cause harm. It can be a strategy to, invest in coaching for people who are having some difficulty adjusting to the new reality, the new commitment of the organization. And then if that coaching is not successful, it then becomes a way to coach people out of their positions, as well as, document things for the evaluation of the performance of those organizational leaders as well.
So aside from the CEO, what can the board do aside from issuing statements, obviously establishing a policy, but beyond the policy statement, what is it that a board can do to impact the situation?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that different organizations have different types of boards. And so boards that have been largely boards that are managing sort of organizational compliance, thinking about the financial sustainability, asking those kinds of boards to take these issues of DEI seriously is a significant shift in what people see their role being on the board. And so I think leaders need to recognize what kind of board they have, what board members have thought their role is or their expectation of their role was. And if this, commitment to DEI is a shift, then, there's some organizing of the board and managing of the board in making that kind of change as well. So I think part of what the challenge and frustration that we hear, I certainly hear from EDs, but I think both Ofronama and I heard it more broadly in focus groups that we've done across the country. I think that for people of color in organizations with boards that are somewhat disconnected from the mission of the organization and from the constituency base of the organization, but are very focused on the resourcing of the organization, they don't really get it, right? And oftentimes board members have been recruited because of their, wealth or position in corporate America. And so, there is a level of education and training and critical and difficult conversations that I think leaders need to have with their boards if they're going to make these shifts and have the board come along with them. But I think we have to recognize that oftentimes staff are pushing the board on these issues. Ofronama, what else have you has come up in either interviews or focus groups related to board management?
Yeah, I would say, in Central Texas, hearing from some executive directors of color that they're facing challenges with the boards themselves in terms of being confronted with stereotypes about the communities they're serving. And that has an impact, right, on the executive directors having to deal with that and potentially on outcomes. I would say that some of the focus group participants did talk about efforts to diversify boards. I don't know if we've talked about that as much. So, the board's majority white, how can we make that less so? And I think that needs to certainly be part of those efforts, not just diversifying staff and leadership, but board as well, but not just doing that in terms of tokenizing, but making sure that board members have equal power, because the dynamics that can occur with staff where there's one or two people driving what happens in strategy and can happen as well on the board.
So before we open up to the audience, I'd like to turn to each of you individually, okay? Because the kind of work you're doing is very, very important. You both serve as role models to other people who may want to pursue similar work. So briefly, if you could talk a bit about who are your role models and why are you doing this?
Okay, I'll try taking a stab at that first. I think that part of the reason that I do this work is, my upbringing as, the kid of two parents, two ministers, but also having seen in particular some of the racism that my mother, who is African-American, my father's white, but so two people who are in the same field and the racism that my mother saw, experienced that really did block some of the opportunity that she would have had in that field. And, I think particularly the dissonance between the espoused values of the faith community that I grew up in, but then seeing the experience of my mother, I think really made me more focused on racial justice as a student, which then I think informed the kind of decisions that I made about my career. I think the other thing that really helped me get to where I am is that I was lucky enough to have always worked for organizations led by people of color, like it's an odd experience, but even when I was a social work student and had my first placement in a direct service organization in my community, it was a Black-run, Black-led organization that was serving the Black community in Minneapolis. And so to go from there to then civil rights organizations in Washington, D.C., I'd always worked in these nonprofit environments where people of color, I could see people who looked like me in positions of power. I was being supported and mentored by both people of color and white folks working in those organizations. And I think it just made for more opportunity than I've seen in many of my peers who've also worked in the sector, but largely worked in white dominant organizations.
Fascinating. Ofronama?
Great. Yeah. For me, growing up, I too saw some of the difficulties my parents faced in achieving employment. For my father is an immigrant and has a college degree and wasn't able to get better positions. My mother is African American and also faced a lot of challenges in the workplace around race and gender. And always wanted to go into the nonprofit field, and a lot of my positions involved helping people find jobs, whether it's college students or young people who were in school, out of school. Decided to switch into a research role about 6 years ago and study public policy, and I'm getting a PhD in that. What's different for me now is focusing less on helping people get jobs, but looking at the policies that are in place that are stopping people from moving ahead. And I would say a mentor for me, so my PhD advisor is Dr. Derek Hamilton, who's an economist, a stratification economist. And what that field looks at is looking at group disparities. And it really shows that it's not about people needing more education or, like the Race to Lead reports have shown, needing more training or more leadership development. Because what you see is that even Black people, Latinx, other people of color with high levels of education still have disparities compared to white people, because it's about group competition, right? And as the higher up people go, the more difficult it will be, because people are fighting to keep their position. So I would say that those are some of the pathways I've taken and some of the things that have inspired me to keep doing this.
Thank you. I always like to ask that question of my guests because I think it becomes really important that all of us take these issues very, very personally. And if we don't integrate them into our own beings, our own thinking, our own worldview, then we end up with tokenism and don't achieve. And 3 years from now, you'll do another report and we'll see the same things. So that's why I always ask that question. I just think it's really important that we all get really serious about this. So with that, I thank you both. I'd like to open it up to questions. And Kate, if you would tell us if there's any questions in the chat or anybody else.
Yeah, so first I'd just like to invite everyone to go ahead and turn their cameras on. You can either put your question in chat or just raise your physical hand and wave at us and let us know you have a question, and we'd love for you to unmute and join the conversation. Hi, Joyce. I'm glad you're here with us. If you give everybody just a minute to get their cameras on. And we don't have a chat question just yet, but if Barry, you want to go ahead with the question?
Let me ask a general question, because I think in the discussions that take place in all these reports and analyses, etc., they translate into concepts and how these concepts apply to people's lives, systems, policies. But I'm fascinated by our inadvertent microaggressions that take place. The things that, with no bad intention, many times, get said or done. So I was wondering if either or both of you could talk about that. You talk about that in your reports, about what are these microaggressions, some examples, so that people could be more conscious about them.
Well, I think both of Ron and I are a little skeptical about like the framing of microaggression. But you know, I think that sometimes there are like misunderstandings, right? So I think people may, you know, mispronounce someone's name, or you know, make an assumption that someone is not, you know, at the level of the organizational hierarchy that they are, and those things can be corrected. But they do have they do put an emotional toll on people. And I think the reality is that there are some people in organizations and in our sector who are having more of that emotional weight put on them. And so it becomes incumbent on people to figure out how to not be continually sort of piling that kind of, you know, BS onto people's plates, essentially. You know, but then there are also things where like it's actually directly aggressive, you know. I think that, and so we pretend that it's a microaggression, but it may be clear that there was intent behind it. And so I think sometimes, you know, I don't want to emphasize intent too much, because really when it comes to issues of race equity, we should really be focusing on impact. But I think we've used this language of microaggression to sort of put everything under the umbrella of it wasn't intentional. But I think in some organizational structures, the stories that I've been hearing, it's pretty clear that there is an intentional conflict that's being played out. And, you know, to sort of couch that as a microaggression feels dishonest, I would say. Fred, what would you add?
I would agree with that. I would also say, so in the survey, there was an opportunity for people to share what types of discrimination they experienced in the workplace and how they handled it. And one thing I would add is that most of the people who described complaining about a discriminatory experience to the board, HR, executive director, supervisor, for the most part, nothing really happened. Either they were forced to sit down and have this uncomfortable conversation with the person. They didn't do, the leaders didn't do anything at all. They ended up being punished. So clearly there's another issue. So if you want to say, okay, maybe it wasn't intentional, but still regardless of the intent, when people are coming forward about their experiences, nothing's being done about it. That's also an issue, and requires organizations to really look at their policies and how they're responding to instances of discrimination and bias and so on.
Thank you. Go ahead, Colleen.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So one of the questions I particularly have is, so I completely recognize that when white people just come up to Black people and say, hey, like, you get it, you know what's going on, what should I say in this situation? Or like the questioning that happens sometimes from white people that is very much, you know, unsolicited. It's just kind of thrown upon people of color. It's not fair to just go and randomly ask, hey, you're a person of color, answer this question about race for me. It's, you know, I find that anyone would find that very uncomfortable. But when you're going about, particularly in a professional setting, really trying to work on your diversity and inclusion efforts, what are some of your suggestions to make it so it's not just, hey, let's have a meeting where we get all the colored people together and start talking about what your issues are? Because that is, I don't know, it just seems so uncomfortable and cringy. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've heard like some of the people within my circle have said, yeah, I don't appreciate when that kind of stuff happens. And so I'm curious, you know, what both of your thoughts might be in terms of making these conversations, having these conversations happen, but more in a more respectful manner.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one thing is you have to assess as an organizational leader the readiness to have that kind of cross-racial dialogue. And so and I think the place to start is asking the people of color in the organization whether that is something that they think would be worth their time. And if they say no, then I would encourage the organization to engage a anti-racism trainer for their white staff in particular, right? I just think the assumption that like everything needs to be done with everybody from the organization participating, puts a toll oftentimes on people of color because they don't need to understand structural racism, they experience it. And, like within a room where white people are getting that information in a targeted and pointed way, yes, there may be some defensiveness, but if that defensiveness is expressed in a room with other white people, at least there's not the emotional toll of people of color having to hear that defensiveness, right? Like, I just think that there's been this, and I think both Ofronama and I were surprised that like more people weren't embracing affinity groups and employee resource groups as a strategy in the data that we collected. It still doesn't quite make sense to me, like the resistance to that strategy, but largely from the perspective, at least my perspective, that oftentimes white people need to be sort of in a room with other white people, getting training, getting support, and airing sort of your own dirty laundry without having people of color having to sort of take care of either bear the emotional burden of hearing it or take care of assuaging people's guilt in that moment either.
I love that.
I hope that's,
I love that.
Ofronama, what would you, I don't know if you have additional thoughts.
I agree with everything you said. Yeah.
How do you frame that in an environment that is fraught with all these tensions and misunderstandings, and as Colleen expressed, uncertainties about what to say? Most people are trying to be sensitive. How would you frame in an organization, yeah, we're going to bring all the white folks together?
I mean, that's where leadership comes in. Like it is like both the responsibility and burden of people with the most power in the organization to say, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We're doing it in this way to alleviate other staff of the burden of having to hold space for their colleagues, because we recognize that given, racism, in the US, that there's a particular need that white people in this organization may have to gain some information, but also to have more open conversations so that they're then ready to have different quality of conversations with their peers of color. And so, but again, like not every organization is at that point, right? And so, then the conversation might be with staff of color. We know that an all staff conversation is probably not the ideal way to proceed here, and that it's going to put an emotional burden and emotional toll on you. However, it's strategic to do it in this way for these reasons. Will you play along, essentially? But, like engage people honestly as co-conspirators, as opposed to sort of pretending that these are the only options. There are a lot of options. There are a lot of different, and I think often competing strategies for how organizations move forward, which I think gets seized upon as an excuse for not doing anything. And I think we have to really sort of take off the table this, like, because we're uncertain about the way to proceed, we're not going to do anything. I think that's very problematic for organizations. And yeah, so I think there should be a bias for action.
Very well put. Ofronama, do you have something to add to that, or? Nope. Okay. So based upon all the work that you guys have done, that you have, and all the input that's coming in from people who are reaching out to you both for support, knowledge, wisdom, etc.? What do you see changing in the next 3 years? If you were to do this report in 3 years from now, what do you think, which I assume you will, but what do you think the difference is going to be?
Ofronama, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Well, I don't think everything will be wonderful and there'll be no more racism, right? Because it is a system and people are benefiting from it, and there's an incentive to not change anything. I do hope that there will be more people of color saying that they have access to funding with the, there's a report that came out echoing Green and, another organization showing that Black-led organizations, especially Black women-led, which we do already, but just putting on paper showing the research are getting less funding, and we're seeing it in our research too. So I hope that at least that part changes, that or narrows to some degree. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. In 3 years, it would be great to see, I think this narrative about philanthropic redlining and the recognition that it exists, I think is putting more pressure on grant-making organizations. And so it would be great if we could see greater support for organizations led by people of color. And I think that if that happens, it could also lead to more organizations that had previously been white-led now being led by people of color, because I think that then it reduces some of the anxiety that white boards have about the potential capacity for a new leader to raise the kind of funds that the previous or exiting white leader had been. I think that another thing that could potentially change is, the actual sort of quality of people's experience in organizations. I think we are at as I said earlier, this does feel like a movement moment, and I think more organizations are taking seriously the need to address issues of inequity inside of their organization. And so even if over the course of the next 3 years, those efforts happen in clumsy or starts and stops or circuitous ways that make some people uncomfortable, my hope is that sort of the great unsettling of this moment will lead to organizations at least being much more clear and direct about their commitment to race equity. And I also want to acknowledge that, it doesn't mean that people's experience will change overnight, but I do think that it is. I would hope that there would be some progress.
I think Brittany has a question.
Hi, yes. I was curious if your research and recommendations around, we've noticed that our organization, as we're reflecting on sort of unintentional barriers, that, some of our retention efforts, if we're already a, primarily white organization, that areas where we're retaining highly qualified staff is perpetuating some of these access issues and pipeline issues to leadership. And so I was curious if you had recommendations around hiring and promotion practices where, things may be in conflict, and how we can utilize those strategies to increase representation in our leadership all across the pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's a really, just a difficult reality that I think often organizations are facing. The sort of assumption that to get the best candidate for a job, it means X things. And maybe in Central Texas, it means that only candidates who graduated from UT Austin are the right candidate. And that then, based on someone who went to possibly a historically Black college or a community college is then not considered as good for the job. But I think there's a lot of racialized layers to some of those assumptions around qualifications that need to be interrogated and unpacked. And if that is a bias, like what school people went to, if you can recognize that that is a bias that people are holding when they're doing hiring, then make some decisions to blind that information, right? Already we know that people, that if the names of candidates are factored in, people with white sounding names end up being more likely to get hired, right? And so it's already a sort of, I hope, a standard practice for a lot of organizations to, redact the name information so that bias isn't factoring into the hiring process. I think in some cases, also thinking about which school people went to should not be factored in, at least not initially. Like, you wait until you've actually had a chance to interview people, then you've got a whole another set of biases that you have to keep in check. But if those are the things that are getting people to be ruled out, just in the process of reviewing interviews, there are steps to take to make for that review process to be a little more equitable.
I think that,
Oh, sorry. And I would add, there's research out there that shows even when Black folks, for example, have degrees from the highest level institutions, you still see disparities in hiring. I think there was a study that was done on resumes, and I think it was like an Ivy League school. And again, there were fewer callbacks for Black people, even though they went to that school. So it's, definitely agree that shouldn't be based only on the college, but even within that, clearly that's not just the only reason. It's a racial bias that's happening, that's stopping people from getting jobs. And I would add, for the retention end, to really look at the experiences that people of color are having in organizations. I remember the focus group, there were some younger staff that we talked to that were, doing a lot of hard work and contributing a lot, but for example, weren't being allowed to present what they found in meetings, were promised promotions and weren't given it. We're trying to do all these DEI efforts and not being compensated for it, and we're kind of being pushed aside and hidden. So really looking at the experiences people of color are having, and that person, those people will leave, because why would anyone want to stay in an organization that isn't appreciating them or giving them a voice? So, really talking to the staff, evaluating what experiences they're having, and also being really clear on what it takes to advance, that there's no excuse that can be made. If people are doing all these different things and they're still not advancing, those steps need to be really spelled out and exposed that there's a barrier issue that's happening.
Yeah, the last thing I would add was just, I think that organizations are shy about declaring that they have that there is a benefit to having a more diverse staff. And so, like, in terms of the job descriptions, like, the real purpose, from my view, of those diversity statements at the, wherever it appears in the hiring announcement, is to let people of color know that it's worth applying to the organization. Like, one of the data points that I don't think we emphasize enough is, like, people of color don't necessarily want to work in majority white organizations. And so, there are reasons that organizations may need to actually think about, well, are we an organization that would be appealing to a more diverse staff? And if not, what are the things that we can do to shift that? I think that there's a lot of introspection that's needed for organizations.
thank you. Joyce, I think you had a question.
Yes, thanks. Brittany and I are actually from the same organization, so my question is along the same topic, because that's one of the action items we've identified is doing job description reviews and making sure that we're really seeking the skills that we need or the level of education that we need, not just using our bias to say, oh, this person needs a degree in XYZ to do this job. So I just wanted some comments or guidance on that. And if there's any resources you could point us to. And also in terms of retention, are there any models that if internally you don't have a lot of diversity in your leadership, what are suggestions for mentorship or some other things that we could do for staff that could look externally or find some resources for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot online about managing implicit bias in hiring processes. So, I think that there are tips and resources out there. but I think that what you're lifting up is the sort of leadership challenge in the organization. And yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is, and this is sort of what I was saying earlier, I think that for when people are considering applying for organizations, I think it's reasonable that one of the things that they do is look at who's already a part of the organizational staff, and then they may make some determinations. And so that I can recognize that it creates a little bit of it can be a limiting factor. But I think then becomes incumbent on the organization to redouble its efforts to have more innovative strategies for recruitment, to maybe have intentional partnerships with local community college as a way of potentially feeding people into the organization, trying other ways of recruiting, or at least getting more out in the community so that the leaders of the organizations have relationships with other organizations in the community that may be more diverse, where the leadership is people of color, so that they could then say to their peers, you know, we're looking for this job. Do you have anyone, or have you, has anyone applied for a similar job that you think might be a good fit for us? You know, like trying to do more of a relational strategy at the top of the organizations might be helpful, because I think, because I do recognize that it can be a challenge for organizations that are not currently diverse to appeal to and bring in more diverse candidates. But those are some ideas that might help.
Thank you. So we've run out of time, but I wanted to give Sean and Ofronama the opportunity to say any last words. If there's anything that we haven't asked or something that you want to make sure is said, let me give you that opportunity, and then we'll close up for the morning.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be here. You know, I would again close with, you know, focusing on, or not focusing too much on the education, the school, the leadership. Oh, we need to narrow requirements, because that's not what we're seeing in our research. We're not seeing that people of color are less qualified or less educated. And so I do want to emphasize that, that is not what the issue is. It's the discrimination that's happening for people of color, even at the highest levels, and maybe perhaps especially at those levels, because it's an issue of competition. So that's what I would just add.
Very well put.
Yeah, and again, thanks so much for inviting us and including us, and hope that folks will feel free to share with us what you try and what's working. Because I think part of the challenge is that there aren't enough examples of organizations making change. And so I think we do need to build a sort of bank of examples of what actually works to provide both inspiration, but also some practical models.
Well, thank you both. Really appreciate your being here. I know you both have very, very busy schedules. I would just point out to everybody, and we'll have this on the page along with this recording on our website, nonprofitaustin.org/civil society. I want to point out that the Building Movement Project has a lot of reports, some of which were referenced in the course of today's conversation. They are all really fascinating reading and very, very informative because I think Austin is like every place else, and we have the same challenges of racism, discrimination, etc. So in closing, I want to thank you all for being here today, especially Sean and Ofronama. And I want to also thank Kate Tolliver, our managing producer, who is usually in the background, who helps make all this possible. You can read more about our guests, access the Building Movement Project, the website, read their reports, find more resources about what we're talking about, see other episodes of this series. Again, civil society at nonprofitaustin.org/civil society. So wish you all a happy and safe day. And again, thank you both for being here today, and be safe. You all take care.
Thanks for having us. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.